So this is a freaking ton of info. And so for your convenience, I've included labels at the top of pretty much the whole video. Should make it easier so you can scrub through on YouTube and find sections that you want to know more about. Yeah, you're welcome. Here's the basic things you're going to need. You can do stock or aftermarket on any of these parts. Get a stock header, a stock up pipe, preferably STI because it doesn't have a cat. Get a downpipe, pull a turbo, just a TD04. You can do a VF39 if you want, but price-wise, TD04s are everywhere and cheap. Hopefully get a turbo off of a Forester because it only has a 5 psi wastegate. And get a intercooler from a Forester. And all these parts just bolt on to your engine. So the rest of the video includes a bunch of information and tips that I've learned after turbocharging my Legacy and after doing all the research. The NA water pump gets in the way of the stock headers. It exits out the bottom and it knocks into the exhaust right here because it's exiting down from the bottom of the engine and coming out this way. On a turbo motor, the water pump comes out the front of the engine and then goes into the radiator. Swapping your water pump for a WRX water pump would probably be a good decision without having to swap out water pumps. I'm using these to space out my header. So what I'm going to do is just cut these flanges off and weld them to this header. If you didn't want to weld them, you could cut these off and do a dual gasket. So put a gasket between this and the block, and then between this and the header. Also, my studs aren't long enough, so I'm going to have to buy longer studs. Cut the ends off so that I can use them as studs. I'm going to run a nut down the ends of them and clean up those threads so that they're able to get bolted up into the engine. I bought heat wrap tape. Got it on Amazon. It was cheap. So I went ahead and wrapped my lower radiator hose just because it's really close to the header. And I also wrapped my AC lines that are back behind the turbo. I wrapped a bunch of other lines and wires and things with that heat wrap. I torched this little hole. I think this was a exhaust gas temperature sensor, and I just used an old wheel stud, cut off the end of it, and it fit perfect in there. Nice weld around the outside on that. So that one is plugged. Here is my O2 sensor, and I'm actually going to use that one, so I'm not going to plug it. Since I put the O2 sensor there in the exhaust manifold, I had to extend my O2 sensor wires so that they'd actually reach. This guy. It's also a good idea to replace this O2 sensor with an O2 sensor from like a WRX. The WRX O2 sensor is designed to take a lot more heat. And so if you use your factory one from your non-turbo car, it'll work for a while, but there's a pretty good chance it'll burn out fairly quickly. Just FYI. Any turbo front cross member is going to have a notch in it for the up pipe to go up through and kind of fit up in that way. So I'm just going to go ahead and notch it. I don't know if I really captured the angle of it with that little outline. So if you don't want to notch your subframe, you can go ahead and just put in a turbo subframe. If you're doing it on an Impreza, get a WRX subframe. If you're doing it on a Legacy, get like a Legacy GT subframe. You'll be set. By cutting that bottom support that I was going to try and leave in, it made it so I could actually get it up in and cut it how I needed to. If you plan on doing any kind of spirited driving, which I would assume you do, you're going to want to go ahead and fill in that area that you cut out. Put in a notch, weld it in, re-support that area of the subframe. And the next thing you need to do is worry about plumbing your turbo. So you need to plumb a TD04 with water and oil. Super easy to do. Right here is where the stock oil pressure sender is. And so you can tee in for your oil feed right at the top of the block. It's like the best place for it because it's right above the oil pump. So before I'd done enough research, I already bought this galley plug. It looks the same. It was 14 bucks. It's brass. And in the description it said it was a galley plug for a Subaru with an 1/8 inch NPT threads. So I searched eBay for an 1/8 inch NPT to banjo stainless braided oil feed line. Then I picked the length I wanted. Now, the one I bought came with the T-fitting. I just used Teflon plumber's tape and wrapped all of the fittings, and it worked out. You might have to play around a little bit to get everything to fit. This was the best configuration I figured out. So the key thing you need to do, and remember when you're doing your oil return, it needs to be below your turbo, and it needs to be a fairly direct route for the hose. And so you can tap into your valve cover, you can tap into the oil pan. Some people even tap, they just run a hose from the oil return on the turbo into the valve cover breather. Now, that's not ideal, but it supposedly works. Now, this is a 5/8 barb to 3/8 NPT male fitting. You don't want to have a bunch of bends or tight curves in your oil return line, because there's a chance you won't get the oil evacuating quick enough out of the turbo, and you'll start burning oil and have other issues like that. I need to figure out what water lines I want to tap into, and there's a water line right here, which would be a very easy one to tap into. So this water line I used is the water line to the throttle body. You could also use the water lines that go in and out of the firewall that run into your heater core. I used this one because it's closer to the turbo, and it made for less piping all over the place. And I have a couple of adapters that are 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch, because the outlets on the turbo are both 1/2 inch. So the charge pipe is the pipe that goes from the outlet of your turbo to your intake manifold. Lots of times they have an intercooler in between. Most of the time they do. On my build, I chose not to run an intercooler just because I'm only running 4 PSI. I would recommend running an intercooler if you can make it work. If you can't, no worries. But if you can, the easiest intercooler to use is a Forester intercooler from an 04 or 05 Forester XT. This will give you enough space so you don't hit the firewall. If you're going to do your own, make sure you either put in a blow-off valve or use a coupler that has space for a blow-off valve, or don't use a blow-off valve. If you're at low boost, blow-off valves aren't really that necessary. I would recommend using a recirculating blow-off valve, or just use a stock bypass valve and route it back into the inlet pipe. On a MAF-based car, you're going to have issues running super rich when you put the clutch in, just because fuel is already added for all that air that has come through the MAF sensor, and if you dump that air pressure in the blow-off valve out, it's just gonna dump a bunch of fuel in because it thinks that air is still there, and so it'll run really rich. If I'm revved up and I just put the clutch in, it'll just drop down and die because it's so rich. It just dies after that, though. And so that's why I just recommend running a block-off plate or not running a blow-off valve. You'll have less issues with plumbing, you'll have less issues with your management, and it'll just work better. Yeah, there's a chance you're going to wear out your turbo quicker, but you're most likely just using a TD04 that you got for $50 online, so who cares?
You gave me a turbo for free.
I'm going to build the inlet hose that goes from my air filter into the inlet of the turbo. I'm going to be running my MAF on that side of the turbo, and also I'm going to have 3 bungs. My valve cover breathers, my PCV valve, and my
idle air control sensor.
So the inlet pipe really doesn't matter unless you're running on the stock ECU. More about that later. I got this set of Spectre, it's a vacuum sensor adapter kit, and basically it's just a bunch of bungs with a couple of hole saws. There we go. I almost don't need to extend this one that far. Look at that. This one over here, I'm on the PCV valve that I need to extend, and then my valve cover breathers, I'll need to reroute, kind of. So all of that stuff was pretty simple. It all just kind of bolts on. You might have to do some minor fabrication for some things, or a lot if you want. But this next part is really the meat of your turbo build, as far as information goes. Most of you probably don't have an open source ECU that you can tune. However, you can still turbo it with good results. So what I'm going over is just using your stock ECU. You can go aftermarket ECUs. There's some really cool stuff available now with Megasquirt or even Speeduino. Check those out. They're cheaper alternatives to a standalone unit. There's also a lot of piggybacks out there that have been out there for a long time, and they work great as well. I'm only covering turboing on the stock ECU. My car has stock injectors and the stock ECU and the stock MAF sensor. The only thing I've upgraded is the fuel pump, and I kind of went overboard. I put in a Walbro 255. You can get away with just using a WRX or an STI fuel pump. My car does just fine with 4 PSI. It can handle redline, no problem. I'm at fairly safe AFRs, and I haven't had any issues for over a year. Now, the main thing you need to realize is that you can't do high boost on the stock ECU. A lot of you are going to want more than 4 or 5 PSI. So, 8 PSI is a WRX stock wastegate. If you want to run 8 PSI, you could just put it all together and run it. I'm not sure how reliable long-term it will be. But the thing you can do to make it more reliable and to make it run a whole lot better is to install an FMU. An FMU it just stands for Fuel Management Unit. It's a rising rate fuel pressure regulator. By installing an FMU, it just adds more back pressure when you get into boost to your injectors, and so they end up squirting in more fuel under boost. It's really a band-aid fix, but it's a fairly simple mechanical way to get more fuel into your engine so you can run more boost.
So if you have a MAP-based car, so manifold air pressure, you want to get an 8-to-1 ratio FMU. If you have a MAF-based car, a mass airflow sensor, like I do on this car, you want a 10-to-1 FMU.
This setup will get you on the road, driving, having fun, making some choo-choo noises, and that's a great starting point. You're most likely going to want to up the boost after a certain amount of time. I'm certainly ready to go more than 4 PSI. It's really fun to drive. It sounds really cool. But it really isn't terribly fast. With that said, I would still totally recommend turboing it. My car is just as reliable, and it has a lot more power, and it has a turbo feel to it. It's a fun car. Just as a few sides, you do want to make sure that your engine is in good mechanical working order before you turbo it. Putting a turbo on it is just going to strain more parts of it. Now, that said, my engine has 185,000 miles on it. I just replaced the head gaskets, the timing belt, timing components, water pump, things like that. But as far as rebuilding it, I don't plan on rebuilding this block. That kind of defeats the purpose of a low budget, low boost turbo setup. I would recommend just turboing whatever you have. As you're doing it, you'll research more and learn more things. You'll be exposed to more, and then you'll be able to make a decision once you have all that experience as to what you want to do. If you want to build a closed deck, high PSI, boosted 2.5, your options are open to whatever engine you want to boost. This is a great way to learn about turbos and a great way to learn about your car. And it's a great way to almost double your stock horsepower. So you might be asking, should I do this to my blank whatever Subaru? And my answer is yes. I would recommend turboing anything. As long as you don't boost it too high, your engine can handle it. I'd be willing to say that any Subaru engine could handle my setup of 4 PSI. It's really not that much more air getting shoved in. It works great. It'll get you the fun you need. It's a blast. Just do it. I'm done talking. Anyway, if you have any other questions, drop them in the comments. I'm happy to answer them. But again, this should get you on the right direction. Have a good one. And keep it dirt cheap.